unsurpassed, penetrating, and perfect Dharma is rarely met with, even in 100,000 million kalpas. Having it to see and listen to, remember and accept, I vow to taste the truth of the Tathagata's teaching.
And now a short reading on the dana. In Buddhism, when Zen practitioners share their understanding of the teachings and practice, it is offered freely as a practice of dana paramita. Dana is a Pali word that means generosity or to give freely, and this practice is done without expectation of getting something in return. This is the spirit of speaking about the Dharma. Other ways to practice dana is to offer support to those who share the teachings, to support places of spiritual practice, and to give without judgment or expectation when opportunity arises. Those who share the teachings at Great Tree do so on a dana basis. Please support their practice by giving what you can. And now I guess it's up to Teijo to continue with her talk on dukkha and the Four Noble Truths. And we invite you to all listen. Thank you.
Morning or afternoon in France. So last week, I just gave a kind of an overview of the Four Noble Truths using Thich Nhat Hanh's explanation, talking about the second noble truth being the path to dukkha, and the fourth noble truth, the Eightfold Path, being the path to freedom or letting go, or cessation it's called. And so how do we nurture those paths? And I thought that was an interesting way to look at it. And he was talking about nurturing, acting in nurturing ways, both in the way in our action, speech, and thought, and also in the way we physically take care of ourselves. What do we feed ourselves with? And to investigate that so that we can, and this, I think this will help us understand the Eightfold Path, which leads to letting go, to investigate the things which lead to dukkha. So that's an interesting way to look at the Four Noble Truths. And one of the reasons I'm talking about them right now is because Susan Lamb is going to be giving 3 talks about desire starting next week. And Susan, raise your hand. It's Susan. And so since desire is the second noble truth, and I don't exactly know what Susan is going to be talking about, she's been investigating this. And now I'm very interested in finding out what she's been thinking about and writing about. But since that's the second noble truth, I thought, well, yeah, it might be good to kind of look at the Four Noble Truths over time this year. So that's what I've kind of got on my radar. And as I mentioned last week, Four Noble Truths is something that I studied in many different ways over the years. Because somehow they just fascinated me. And then I came to understand that actually that's the first teaching of the Buddha and the most fundamental teaching of Buddhism. So I'm glad I chose that as my subject to study. But I wanted to kind of see if I could look at it from a new way, because it seems like I'm always talking about Four Noble Truths in the same way. And this week I found, the Tibetans have things very organized. I found a little clip on YouTube on Pema Chodron talking about the 3 ways, the 3 categories of dukkha, or she says suffering. And I don't like to use the word suffering because I feel that suffering is we have sort of have a very limited understanding of the word suffering in American culture. So I usually use the word dukkha because then we have to investigate and try and figure out what that means. But I feel very strongly that it's very important for us to be able to identify. In fact, I think this is the heart of our practice, to identify the kind of suffering that Buddha was talking about, or that Buddhism talks about, and in terms of our own experience. And therein lies the freedom, because there's something that we need to see that we're doing, and we need to see it when we're doing it as much as possible. That helps us to kind of let go of that thing which is dominating our mind and our actions and even our eating habits. So it tips us in a certain way. And what is it that tips us to that, the experience of anxiousness and dissatisfaction, and Pema Chodron calls it insecurity. So anyway, these three categories are what are called the suffering of suffering. And these, I think, I didn't look, I kept meaning to look, but right now my floor has just been replaced in my bedroom, and it's just been finished painting as of yesterday. And so I'm living upstairs and I don't know where all my books are. But I'm pretty sure that this is in the first teaching of the Buddha about these three kinds of suffering. These categories, she calls them categories. So the first one is, in Buddha's words, or from the sutra, suffering of suffering, which she calls ordinary suffering, but I kind of give it a term, apparent suffering. In other words, the suffering which we can see so easily and can define as suffering. And so it's not to say that that's not suffering, but there's other forms of suffering that we're not able to see. So those are things like neglect, poverty, hunger, homelessness, violence, discrimination, things that are very apparent, those kinds of sufferings. So that's what's called ordinary suffering. And it's only called ordinary because it's something that is that we can identify as suffering, or that we can come to identify. Of course, we can ignore those things too, but if we hear the word suffering, those are the things that, as I say, are apparent, that are noticeable, that are seen by us or heard by us or experienced by us in some way. The second suffering is the suffering of impermanence. And that's something that very early on, when I started thinking about dukkha, I started to kind of, especially looking at the second noble truth of desire as something that is a great cause of attachment. It seems to me like the ultimate attachment. It's I think pretty apparent, although it's very hard to talk about. But the ultimate attachment is attachment to permanence. And is played out, if you think about it, by death itself and how we react to death, particularly of those close to us, because people that we identify with or are identified with in some way, a close family member or a close friend, or someone we do this practice with, because that creates a very deep connection, or any kind of spiritual practice with. To lose people, and that gives us a glimpse of what we experience at the death of someone close, which is, I remember when my teacher died, for a while I felt like part of me had died. So there was some part of me that identified with him in some way. And, you know, a parent, a parent is even more so, mother, you know, you've been inside your mother. You must have had some identification. But impermanence is really something that happens all the time. And it really is a cause of suffering in our everyday lives. I remember before I started meditating, and meditating for me means processing. And before I started meditating, I used to, you know, get to these points where everything came together in a big screen, you know. And I think that's from not recognizing things as they're changing and holding on to some kind of an end. And so, but not being able to recognize impermanence, and you know, we need to investigate why that is. Why is it that we are maybe afraid to process something? Why is it that we are uncomfortable when we're sitting sometimes? And I've come to discover that those times of real discomfort, when I just feel like, why am I sitting here? I can't sit still. That those times are the times when something is coming up that if I stay on the cushion, stay with it, that I will look at it and realize that it's something that, you know, I've attached to as something I'm afraid of because of some historical thing, and it gets into our bodies, and it's what creates karmic habits. We act in a certain way because we think in a certain way. It was very interesting to me what Thich Nhat Hanh said in the clip I was talking about last week. He said, the Eightfold Path, he's talking about these two paths, the path that leads to dukkha and the path that leads to letting go. And he said, the path to letting go, or the path to cessation, the third noble truth, begins with right view. And this right, and I've said this before, but it's translated from the word sama, which is a Pali word, which actually means to walk with or to harmonize with. So it's not this right and wrong kind of thinking. So if you think about what is a view which harmonizes with things as they are, which harmonizes with impermanence and the interdependence within which we were, what is that? And then he says, on the path to dukkha, it's wrong view. So what is the wrong view that is feeding? This is what he says we need to investigate. And you could go through the whole entire Eightfold Path. I was thinking about this afterwards. You could go through the Eightfold Path, and what is wrong view? What is wrong action? I mean, not in terms of right and wrong. What is unharmonious view? What is unharmonious action? What is unharmonious speech in my life? And that's what, you know, that's what leads to our dukkha, and of course it leads to conflict. So the suffering of impermanence, and I did write down a few things that Pema said about it. She said, it's somewhat inherent in human beings. We want things to stay the same, and they don't. And we have the propensity to prefer pleasure to pain. And even those who prefer pain get pleasure from it. And the suffering of impermanence includes the fact that there is pleasure in life, but it alternates and shifts and changes. So, you know, that's kind of a way of talking about it, but you know, we each have to investigate how we experience this suffering of impermanence. And I've been talking about bodhicitta, and bodhicitta is seen as the way-seeking mind, and what brings us to this practice. But it's also what we continue to awaken to. Maybe that original intention, or that original. I think it's letting go, because many of us came to this practice, or go to any spiritual practice, for comfort in times of conflict, in times of difficulty. I certainly know that was true in my case. And at those times, we have to let go of something. And that letting go, at that moment of letting go, which you can't really pinpoint, or I don't think you can, that moment of letting go is the moment of awakening, because that letting go is what allows us to just experience life, which is impermanent and interdependent. And when we act out of that moment, it's the most harmonious action. So this constant letting go. At the same time, of course, we have to be functional in life. So that becomes a problem. But one of the problems is that we want to attach to something that, as she said, it's somewhat inherent in human beings. We want things to stay the same. We want something that gives us a sense of stability, but they don't. So to acknowledge that, even as we try to make sense of things. Well, and she goes on to say, wanting to stay smooth and open forever doesn't happen, because things change and we change. So even if you experience a very harmonious place, really, as soon as you notice that you're in that, you're experiencing that, noticing of it sort of puts you into a different, back into thinking mode. If there wasn't any pleasure, this whole thing would work a lot better. She said her daughter told her that when she was about 14. If there wasn't any pleasure, this whole thing would work a lot better. Because we have a tendency to want to hold on to pleasure, hold on to those pleasurable experiences, and also to grasp for them, thinking that there is a place. When I got into Zen practice, I thought, oh yeah, this is going to help me just get there and be there, which, not acknowledging impermanence. And then the third kind of suffering is called all-pervasive suffering. And this is the thing that I talk about the most. She talks about both of these other ones, this suffering of impermanence and also this all-pervasive suffering, as being the most subtle, because it's not something that we see so easily. We see violence easily. We see, a discrimination. We can see that. I mean, we don't always see it so easily, but we can see it a little bit more graphically. But this all-pervasive suffering and the suffering of impermanence are a little more difficult. And this is the way she describes it: the suffering of wanting ourselves, our own situation, to remain stable, not wanting insecurity, not wanting uncertainty, wanting predictability, wanting a sense of security, something that we can hold on to. But that's not the way it is. And so somehow, to be able to recognize that, I think she even goes on to talk about that, to be able to recognize that. And I say, even at the moment of recognition, that is the moment of, it's the moment of letting go, and it's the moment of awakening. We used to study the Four Noble Truths at Warren Wilson, and we would I would do the first 4 weeks. We met 5 days a week. I would do the first 4 weeks on the first 4 noble truths, on each of the noble truths. I do 1 a week, and then we would have some kind of reports from everybody afterwards. And they had discussions about them. I gave them questions, what is dukkha, and gave them references, gave them books and things like that. And they would write in their journals, they would try to, and they'd be writing, I don't understand this, and that's the way it is when you're kind of investigating the 4 noble truths. It's like, I don't understand. How does dukkha work in my life? And then we would read Dhamma children when things fall apart. And I said, I want you to write down at least 1 thought or 1 response to each chapter. And because she was saying pretty much the same thing. She was describing what the experience is when things fall apart. And each one of them would get to a point in that book where they're saying, she's saying the same thing over and over. Here's what she's saying over and over. And then they'd go, oh, I see what I'm doing that's creating suffering in my life. So it takes that moment. It's kind of, I say it's like stepping beyond our resistance. It's taking that 1 step beyond resistance. So if you can recognize that you're resisting, to just take a step, it either tells you that that resistance is important and pay attention to it, or that that resistance is based on some kind of karmic way of thinking. And that can be a problem, because we identify so much with the way we think. It's actually a gift to be able to see the way we're thinking with our thinking. We're not really seeing it with our thinking, are we? It's kind of when we let go of our thinking, that's when it. So that moment when we see that, oh, I'm thinking too much, or, oh my gosh, I think like that. That moment, it's transformative. It changes our life, but we can't make ourselves get there. So we sit on a cushion and look at a wall. And for some reason, we can watch our own movie. But to be aware of these things like dukkha and what's causing it, and what we can do to bring about harmony or freedom from this thing which is holding us, that we're not really noticing that. To understand that is, improves our lives, and it also improves the lives of the people around us. And, oh yeah, I know one of the things she says that really stood out to me is, and this is something I talk about, to be free of the all-pervasive suffering means we are comfortable with the feeling of insecurity. So, not thinking about it as, I want to get rid of this feeling, but it's being comfortable with it. And of course, that's that step beyond our resistance, I think. So I'm going to stop there, and what time is it? Oh, it's 10:30 about.
Is this a time to ask questions?
Yeah.
Okay.
Ask and speak.
Okay. Can you elaborate just a little about the difference in Pema Chodron's view between the second kind of suffering and the third kind of suffering? Because as I took notes on it, my notes look like it's the same.
Yeah, and they do kind of overlap. I had exactly the same problem. I had to watch the video like 4 times to kind of get that. So what I think is the difference, this, and they are very close, but I think that the suffering of impermanence is not being able to let go of our ideas of what is next, to the point where we can't recognize what's happening in the moment. And, you know, I mean, you could, well, I won't go there. And whereas the suffering, all pervasive suffering, is that feeling that we feel that I'm not good enough, or thinks this isn't it. It's that kind of chasing after something, rather than just being comfortable with our insecurity. Thinking, oh, well, I need another degree, or I need a different job, or I need a new car, or, you know, and of course, none of these things are permanent. So it creates a constant sense of dissatisfaction.
Yeah.
So it's sort of coming at the same thing from two different directions.
Uh-huh. Okay.
Does that make sense?
So, yeah, it sounds like the all pervasive suffering is more about our ideas about the particular things that will finally make us enough.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's this constant kind of, if you feel good, being worried that it's not going to last, trying to figure out a way to hang on to it. And if you're feeling bad, trying to find some way to run away from that, or get away from that. And whereas, and it's always, we're always in one state or the other. So how do we deal with that? Can we just be comfortable with it? Or does it cause us to think we need to do something more, you know, or do something else? Or can we just be with that feeling and let its impermanence play itself out? And that's where they kind of overlap, you know.
Okay.
But it's all the same. It's just different ways of looking at the same thing. And even ordinary suffering, you know, at one point I realized that if something happens that we didn't want to happen, that's a problem, we can freak out, you know, or we can say, okay, now what? What do I do about this? You know, and eventually we're going to have to get to that point anyway. But what causes us to freak out? What causes us? And I'm thinking about a particular situation one time, because this is, I think, something Zazen has really helped me understand. I was backing out of a parking space and I backed into something, and my friend was with me. And I immediately started thinking, okay, you know, how can I get this taken care of? Will my insurance cover it? That kind of stuff. And, you know, I took a few deep breaths, and my friend was freaking out. She was saying, you just bumped into this post. Doesn't that make you upset that you just dumped it? She was really upset that I wasn't upset. And it's interesting, though, that we do go to that place. Certain things will trigger us to go to that place. I mean, that was an unusual situation, and it was probably because I'd had many accidents in my life, and I knew that, you know, why go there? But also, I think Zazen helps me to see that there's no point in having that kind of reaction, but we do have that kind of reaction. And so to be able to recognize it, sooner we can recognize it, you know, and just be present with it, the better, the less angst we have to experience. You know, you can sort of see the freedom in all of this, right? But it's, as Kadagiri Roshi used to say, good luck. That means it's up to you. Any other thoughts or comments about any of this?
I have noticed in my life that when I was younger, like in my 20s, and I was, doing things that put me in situations that I didn't know how to deal with, in like situations of seeing people's impossible lives and feeling helpless, really, I used to call that, and then I would end up just crying. I mean, anything would send me off. And I used to call it having a bad case of the human condition. But what I've noticed over the decades is that I think my way of experiencing things now, I mean, I have a lot more ways of distancing myself that I notice. Doesn't always work, but makes things different. But I also think in some way, the way I register things now is somehow even deeper, and I may have more trouble actually accessing those dynamics, that, I could go out to the woods in my 20s and sleep in the woods a couple nights and be there, and then I could come back and function again. Whereas I don't have quite such a simple remedy now, I think things kind of permeate your being more as you accumulate more and more of them, and yeah, I think it's just interesting, and I don't have any solutions. I mean, sitting helps, but do you have any thoughts about that?
No, I don't. Anybody? You?
I do think about the fact that as mobility is limited as we age, that we have fewer ways to, I don't know, let things go. Like I noticed when I first had children, and I couldn't just sit and read for hours at a time. It's like, oh, that's harder. You have to sort of process things as you go. And life, that does seem to be the way life works. It's why we need sitting, right?
Thank you.
So. Yeah, and I think sitting helps a lot with the processing, especially, as you notice as we get older and we're slowing down and we don't have quite as many options for escape. That, you kind of have to process that stuff, but sitting has been a great aid to me in recognizing that, if you got to slow down, at least there's some way of dealing with it other than escapes, all those typical escapes.
Teijo, I have a question about habit energy, and it's hard to fit that one into any one of the three categories because everything's interdependent. But how do you see that fitting in? Habit energy.
See, I'm not used to these kind of categories because Zen is a lot looser.
Everything's together, so it's hard
Yeah,
to.
I know. I mean, it's just, I think one of the problems with our habit energies is that because of our way of thinking about a particular thing, we act in a particular way. And thus we might react in anger to something just from out of habit, that when it triggers a particular experience that made us upset at one point, that we respond with anger, that it becomes a habit. And that's how I think of habit energy. And so to recognize those habit energies as the ones that are producing negative things is sort of a way of investigating the second noble truth, which is the path that leads to. So that's how I sort of think about it. I don't know how it fitted into this system of suffering, but certainly our habit energies. I mean, I react to things in ways sometimes that I'm surprised, and I really don't know why I react in that way. And I think, the Dalai Lama points this out in relation to karma, that to recognize that we're doing that is a big step. And so, I mean, how it fits into all of this is, I think that to recognize our habit energies, both ways in which we think that are creating harmony and ways in which we think that are creating disharmony. I mean, I see that as we're either creating dukkha for ourselves and consequently everybody else, or we're helping to find freedom or experience freedom. And when I'm experiencing freedom, other people around me are experiencing freedom. That's just the way it is, because we're interconnected. And not just other people, but all other beings. What kind of I started out, when I first came to North Carolina, I started talking about the Vimalakirti Sutra. And one of the things that is in the Vimalakirti Sutra is it talks about creating a Buddha field. And so I was trying to understand what that meant. And, I talked about it at sessions and things like that. I said, let's create a Buddha field, But I'm beginning to understand it as, creating a harmonious environment. And it starts with each one of us. Each one of us has to make that effort, but we affect, it's how, being aware of how we affect other beings. Are we creating a harmonious environment, or are we creating a disharmonious environment? And psychologists are starting to recognize that, the ways in which we were raised and the environment in which we were raised affects the way we behave, and affects the kind of energy field that we function in. So I mean, I don't think I've answered your question, but.
Thank you. Yes. Very helpful.
Liliane, Miran, did you have something you were going to say?
Yeah, I was going to share a thought about impermanence, and my own observation of my psyche is that I realized that impermanence is not only it's not negative, not something that we have a hard time with, but also sometimes something we don't trust, because there's the opposite way to be really impatient and to want things to happen in our own, at our own rhythm, and not in a harmonious way, which is what you were saying about dukkha, not being in harmony. So the thought that came to me is, in a way, impermanence is about our relationship to time, being in harmony with time, and the rhythm of time, which is we can create our own suffering and dukkha because we're not in sync or in harmony with that rhythm. So there's a time for things to go, and whether we were ready for it or not. But there's also such a thing as being patient and staying with a situation, or and not pushing to make it finish too soon because it's uncomfortable. So I was just thinking about that relationship also of trust that maybe we need to develop with impermanence. That's
And I mean, there's, I mean, that trust is right there, because we don't really, to recognize that we don't know what's going to happen next. It's that's very uncomfortable.
right. And the other comment that came with Anne's comment is that it seems like indeed it's a difficult thing to here too is a fine line between empathy and compassion. And I know Joan Halifax in one of her books talks about that, because she worked in quite a few organizations, and I think she has a term for that, empathic distress, I believe, where we lose ourselves and our ability to respond. And so it's not an easy task to keep our heart open to compassion and not become indifferent, or not to want to see the suffering because it distresses us too much. And then, yes, that empathy where we lose also ourselves. I don't know if you have anything to say about that too, Teijo, but I know I struggled with that too. That fine line between compassion, indifference, and empathy and distress.
No, I don't have anything to say, but that's a really interesting point to me. And I recognize what you're talking about too.
I had a question, Teijo.
Thank you.
Thank you for the talk. I was wondering about just like the relationship of dukkha to the fact that like we have to make decisions and we have to take action every day and on larger and smaller areas of our lives, and just I don't know how you come at that, because there is like I don't know, there are the practical realities of life, and like as a mother of a small child, like I want to make decisions that create more stability and less suffering for Rowan, and I do feel a lot of suffering from my attachment to that, and just like being really clenched around the decisions. I'm like, is this the right action? And I know the answer is not to just be like, I'm not gonna make decisions and I'm just gonna let everything flow. And yeah, I'm just wondering kind of how you apply teachings to that, like taking right action.
I mean, I think for any of us, the difficulty is getting caught in the movement. I mean, we have to do something, but then we get caught in the momentum of what it is we're doing, and we forget to stop and take a breath. You know what I mean? And yeah, I mean, I think the mindfulness bell is really helpful for that, because I know myself, when I hear the mindfulness bell, I know that I want to take a breath when I hear the mindfulness bell. Sometimes I choose not to take a breath, you know, and I think about that. I think, well, what about those times when I choose not to take a breath? But at least I feel like, well, at least I've stopped and thought about where I am in the greater scheme of things, you know? Yeah, because I think that what throws us off in terms of our balance and thus harmoniousness is that we get on a sort of a, I don't know if it's called a trajectory or something. We go in a certain direction, and it has a sort of momentum, and it carries with it all of our emotional stuff, and we don't stop to say, where am I right now? You know, and really take a breath, because it is a body-mind thing. And sometimes just stopping, and even if you don't take a breath, I found that I kind of say, okay, you know, where am I? And that alone, I think, and this is what I think meditation helps us recognize our need for. I don't know whether just, I mean, I think starting in the morning with meditation is a good way to kind of advise us through the day, keep us kind of awakened. But even if we can't do that, or even if we do that, it seems like we can get so caught up in the momentum of whatever's happening in life. And I'm not just talking about what's happening in our personal lives, but what's happening in the bigger energetic in which we function, that we're not so consciously aware of, but it still affects us. Does that make sense? So even to stop from time to time and tune into that, and not just always say, you know, I'm the one that's off balance. Maybe it brings forth our imbalances, but to just recognize our imbalances and that they might be influenced by something bigger. I think that's I don't know. I think that's the only way to function in life. Myself, I don't know if that really addresses your question or not. I'm not a mother. I saw Susan nodding. I haven't been a mother, so I don't know it from that perspective.
No, that's really helpful. Thank you.
I know you have a mindfulness bell, right? And your child knows how to use mindfulness bell, which is a plus.
Yeah, I was crying the other day and he climbed up on the bed and he's like, Mama, when I cry, I take 3 deep breaths.
You did something right, Autumn. That's beautiful. Thank you. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, thank you, Teijo, for your talk. I mean, the part that I'm thinking about right now or working with, trying to work with is what you said about one step beyond resistance. And you mentioned a couple of different points about that. And I'm not sure I understand both of them, but you know, one of them was about, you know, the resistance was based in our karmic way of thinking, but that it's also important to move beyond it. And I don't know, it's like I think and maybe you mean, or maybe this means that being aware of when the resistance is actually healthy, when it's like, oh, you know what, like my resistance to, I don't know, jumping in that cold water is telling me it's probably not a good idea to jump in that cold water. Or like my resistance is based on my perception that it's cold water. And or that it's going to be worse than it really is, or something like that. And you know, like I can very easily talk myself out of resisting something like injustice, because I think I can say, oh, it's pointless to resist, I'm going to lose anyway. But actually, I think for me, like knowing when it is appropriate to resist, and how I can work with that, is important. And it's hard to, I mean, that depends on the situation. And also, you know, having an awareness that at some point my resistance is no longer going to be helpful. You know, like at some point I need to recognize that whatever it is I'm resisting, and whatever I'm telling myself about that situation, that whatever is happening, you know, the thoughts like, oh, this is, you know, my fault, or I was stupid to even resist, or any, you know, those thoughts are actually not helping that, you know, that certain loss of me not getting what I want, or things not going my way, you know, or things not going the way that I thought they would or think they should, that at some certain point, you know, I have to recognize that and stop resisting reality and figure out how to deal with that discomfort and move on. So you know, it's like when you were talking about it, I was like thinking about what I learned about, you know, working with my own edges. My edges are my resistance, and how, you know, it can be helpful to lean into the edges, but my personal edges, but at some point, you know, acknowledging these are my limits, but wanting to like grow and expand also, in a way that is healthy for me and not harmful, without me like going literally over the edge. So I don't know, like if any of that makes any sense at all, but or if you know, want to just say more about what you meant, you know, about one step beyond resistance, that would be helpful.
I think you kind of hit on it. I think there's a kind of resistance that we can have that we don't recognize, and it just becomes a kind of stubbornness. But I think if we recognize, oh, I'm being resistant. I mean, you don't have to say those words, but just to see it. I think for me, I can pretty much tell if I'm just being stubborn, or if there is really something that I need to pay attention to, you know. And when I'm just being stubborn, I know that I need to just step out of that stubbornness and walk into the situation, even though it's not maybe something I feel like doing or like, or even saying something, you know. But I think it's more of a mental attitude that I was referring to, you know. And so I think you kind of hit on it when you were talking about that, and just that recognition to me is all we have to just say, just to know that, oh, I'm just being stubborn, or oh, gee, maybe I should pay attention to this, rather than just kind of letting your karmic habits carry you into more suffering. No, because sometimes when we don't act and we need to act, it's just really dukkha. I don't know if that is a response or not. Does anybody else have another point? We've got about 3 minutes. Okay, thank you very much. May the merit of this practice
May the merit of this practice
benefit all beings
benefit all beings
and bring peace.
and bring peace.
Thank you all. And thank you for your comments.